He's such an important part of the Enlightenment. You can't think of European civilization without thinking of Voltaire.
Think of Candide, for example, Dictionnaire philosophique, Traité sur la tolérance, so quotable, he couldn't write a dull word.
When you say we'll publish the complete works of Voltaire, where do you start? He was absolutely prolific.
The language is so perfect and the style is so exquisite. He can just reach out across the sort of centuries and just make you laugh. And I just find myself chuckling away and thinking, oh, Voltaire.
Born in 1694, Voltaire was many things to many people.
We've got a gorgeous Hubert painting of the Dîner des Philosophes, or the Sainte-Seine, which is an imagined scene of Voltaire sort of holding court with other 18th century writers. It's a really lovely depiction of how he was at the centre of this sort of intellectual network.
In Voltaire's day, I think he was first and foremost seen as a poet and as a playwright. Now we think of more his battles for justice.
He was an innovative thinker. He used literature as a way of bringing about change and making a difference.
He has his first huge success with the public in 1718. That's the first time he uses the name Voltaire. For 60 years, he remains a major name right at the front of that literary world until 1778 when he dies, and that's extraordinary.
Voltaire occupe une place très particulière dans la mémoire collective, dans la culture française, qui est une place absolument prépondérante. Même ceux qui ne connaissent pas l'œuvre de Voltaire, qui ne l'ont pas vraiment lu, connaissent sa personne, connaissent son engagement.
In 1791, the French revolutionaries need heroes. There is an extraordinary ceremony when Voltaire's mortal remains are transferred to the Panthéon. And so they choose Voltaire really as their intellectual model.
Voltaire a porté en lui, je dirais, l'esprit français dans sa modernité. Alors Voltaire, il représente pour moi la découverte d'une espèce de bonheur à lire, une sorte de jubilation.
From our perspective, we want to include everything. There is no library in the world, not in France, not anywhere else, that has anything close to all his printings. So this is a hugely laborious and time-consuming process, but the result is fantastic.
We are so lucky to have the Taylor Institution in Oxford. It's an amazing place for all literary scholarship, but particularly for 18th century study. It's an incredibly valuable resource. It's been a place where people can work and people can find what they need. We're always popping down to check a reference, and it's such a beautiful space as well. The Voltaire Room was part of Theodore Besterman's bequest to the university.
Well, the Voltaire Foundation was created by Theodore Besterman, who was an extraordinary character. He was English, he was self-educated, he was passionate about all sorts of things, and after the war he became passionate about Voltaire. He began this extraordinary enterprise, which was to edit the whole of Voltaire's correspondence, an enormous project that took him 15 or 20 years.
He edited it again in order to include it in this edition, which is a pretty astonishing sort of feat to do 51 volumes, not once but twice.
When Besterman started working on Voltaire, he was based in Geneva, and then he came to Banbury and he set up in Thorpe Mandeville House.
And then in 1967, two English Voltaire scholars, William Barber and Owen Taylor, went to Besterman and asked him if he would essentially finance an edition of the whole of Voltaire's writings.
And they were keen on just having a nice replacement for the Mollon edition, the 19th century edition. Eventually it grew. It became a much more ambitious project with the collation of variants and editorial notes and introductions to each text.
Besterman had understood by the early 70s that he wasn't going to live to see the end of the project.
He bequeathed the funds to the university.
And since then, it's been established as a department within the University of Oxford.
Our edition is the first to really go back to first principles and rethink the whole corpus.
Besterman's plan was to produce the works in a chronological sequence.
We go by the date of substantial composition of a text. So it gives you a completely different view of him as a writer, you can see the different types of things he's thinking about all the time. There is an astonishing amount of work in the corpus.
It contains obviously all the different genres that Voltaire wrote in. So we have his plays, his poetry, his philosophical works, his politically engaged works.
He writes histories, dialogues, high verse, formal verse for tragedies, epic poetry, comic verse. He's always experimenting with literary form, and he writes occasional verse. He's probably the most brilliant author of occasional verse.
We've got 205 volumes. A quarter of those are correspondence, so he wrote an incredible amount of letters. And we have the marginalia.
In his library, kept in St. Petersburg, you can see lines in the margins or scraps of paper inserted between pages.
And so the marginal writings of Voltaire constitute 10 of the 205 volumes that make up the set. It is the first time, really, that the whole of Voltaire's writings have been edited critically. That's never been done before. So it's the first full scholarly edition, and it's almost certainly the last time it will ever be printed.
To make a critical edition, the first thing we need to do is choose a base text, and that's up to the scientific editor. Usually we go back to the 1775 edition of his complete works that Voltaire oversaw himself, but we don't want to lose the other versions of that text, and we carefully read each against each of the other versions, and we note where they differ. And those differences are called variants. Alongside that, we also have editorial notes, so the notes of the modern editor who's worked on the text to clarify something or to explain or to draw links with other works of Voltaire's. We'd also sometimes have authorial footnotes, so they are footnotes that Voltaire himself added. That has a sort of status as a footnote, but it's also part of the text.
The top tier is Voltaire's own notes, the second tier is the variant readings, and the third tier is the editorial footnotes.
It's pretty unusual that the works of a great French writer are being edited in England. I mean, I think if somebody proposed that all Shakespeare should be edited in France, everybody would find that extremely peculiar.
Il y a même quelque chose de presque scandaleux, qu'il ait fallu que ce soit nos amis anglais qui réalisent cette extraordinaire édition. Mais c'est très bien. Vive la Voltaire Foundation et vive Nicolas Cronk et toute son équipe.
But what's important is that we learn still from what he had to tell us about the importance of free inquiry, freedom of speech, rationality. He's an important voice for all ages.
Alors j'ai déjà dit que nous devrions avoir honte, ça n'ait pas été fait en France, plutôt qu'à Oxford. Mais Voltaire a fondé une grande partie de sa pensée politique sur le modèle anglais, comme l'avait fait Montesquieu avant lui. Il faut rappeler que les philosophes, les grands esprits du XVIIIe siècle étaient fascinés par la construction politique anglaise. Je voulais, dans mes fonctions de chancelier de l'Institut et de membre de l'Académie française, marquer la gratitude que doit la France à ce qui a été fait par cette édition des œuvres complètes.
I think looking forward, completing the paper edition isn't the end, it's the beginning of a whole new way of thinking about publishing Voltaire.
We've started digitising the edition, and we want to enrich this data. We don't just want to present it as a sort of facsimile of what we've got in print. We want to enable people to delve into it in different ways. And there are things you can do in digital that you just can't do when you're constrained by a page.
If you take the whole of his complete works as a data set and you examine it in new ways, you're bound to come across patterns and things that just as an individual sitting down in front of a lot of books you can't see because your brain isn't big enough to take it all in at once.
For me, it's been an enormous privilege as a scholar to have the chance to lead this project. But the real privilege was working with the team and the people. I mean, I've met an enormous number of people and we have done extraordinary things together.
The process of editing the complete works has really been a big team effort.
We think there have been over 200 scholarly contributors over the 55 years of the project. And everybody has played such a huge part. It's always been a collaborative enterprise.
We've been quite difficult sometimes over the years. When we were printing the marginalia, We had to reproduce Voltaire's squiggles in print. I mean, there aren't many typesetters that can actually take the time to do it. So we've brought together not just amazing academics and an amazing team, but also all the skills of printing and typesetting, all the things that Voltaire liked.
The whole of the complete works runs to 205 volumes in the end. It's a real honour to have been around at the right time, to have been able to take part in that.
Hopefully he would appreciate what we've tried to do and that we've tried to treat his work with respect and attention. He changed his mind a lot as well, I think, as well. He was quite hard to please.
I think he would have been amused at the fact that there's this great project undertaken over the Channel.
It's a really big part of our humanities success here, this work, and it's an example of individual scholarship by very distinguished researchers, and they've just done a wonderful job.